1974, Korean-American Chol Soo Lee was wrongly convicted for the murder of gang leader Yip Yee Tak in San Francisco. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he spent a decade before his exoneration that was made possible after investigative journalism by K.W. Lee. His reporting led to a coalition of support for the imprisoned E from Asian Americans who were appalled by the injustice that unfolded in the Sacramento courtroom, from ineffective counsel to false testimony by police inspectors as well. This story has now been captured in a documentary called Free Chol Soo Lee by directors Ha and Eugene Yi, who have joined us now in the studio to talk more about it for this week's Touch Base in Seoul. Hello, and thank you for your time today.
Hello, great to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, first off, can you first introduce yourselves to our listeners as well? I understand, Miss Ha, you are a journalist, not a filmmaker by trade, and this was your first feature documentary.
That's right. I am a print journalist by profession. I was a newspaper reporter for several years, and then I was the editor of a Korean American magazine called Korea24. And actually I was inspired to become a journalist by K.W. Lee, the journalist featured in our film.
Right, okay, so you have that connection as well. So you must have known about this story already.
I did. I learned about it when I was 18 years old. That's when I met K.W. Lee, and I was really shocked to learn at that age that our American criminal justice system could actually put an innocent man in prison. So it was actually quite a mind-blowing discovery at that young age. Yeah.
And Mr. E, can you introduce yourself for our listeners as well? I believe you are more involved in film, right?
Yes, my name is Eugene Yi. Hello. And yes, I have a background in film, primarily focusing on film and video editing. But I also have a background in print journalism as well. And it's through that print journalism work that I met Julie at Korea Journal, as well as K.W. Lee, through whom I learned about the case as well.
Okay, so you knew about the case as well before you collaborated on this film?
Yes, I did. But it was shocking that I had not learned about this, that so many of us had not learned about this in school at some point, because, I mean, you think about it, it's this historic moment where Asian Americans come together and free an innocent man from death row, from prison. And yet, this was not something that we learned about growing up, and there's just so much about that has to do with being a minority in America, not having our stories as respected or as valued as other people's stories. So we just, I think for both of us, like a big motivation was the fact that this case was not well known, and to make sure that future generations would know about the story and this history.
Right, so for me as a British Korean, I didn't know about this story either, but I'm guessing even within the Asian American community, the Korean American community in the US, it wasn't that well known then.
That's right. Back in the 70s and early 80s, when this case was actually happening and a movement had formed, it was actually a well-known case. We were talking like even our parents knew about the case because it was in the news in Korean newspapers, but it became forgotten in the decades since. And actually, you know, the seeds to make this film were planted at Chol Soo Lee's funeral. I had attended the funeral to write an obituary for my magazine, but also to check on the journalist K.W. Lee, my mentor, because I knew he was in tremendous pain after Chol Soo Lee had died unexpectedly. And it was really in the funeral space where I felt this overwhelming heaviness. And that heaviness sort of stayed with me for many months. And that's why, you know, when Eugene and I, who had collaborated together as journalists, were talking about making a film together, I spoke of this heaviness to him. And we sort of just knew, especially as second-generation Korean Americans, we couldn't allow this history to stay buried. And it was almost our generational responsibility to tell it.
Can you tell us a bit more about the story itself for our listeners? How did this injustice come about?
Sure. So Chol Soo Lee was arrested for a Chinatown gangland murder in 1973. The police were looking for a Chinese suspect, but arrested him instead, largely because of the testimony of 3 white tourists. And through that, he was convicted. And it just sort of goes to show you a lot of what was happening at the time. It was a violent time in Chinatown. There was violence, but the police were not in a position to really properly engage with the community in a way with the kind of sensitivity necessary so that this sort of incident and this sort of travesty wouldn't happen.
So it's a shocking injustice. You wanted to shed light on it again, I'm assuming, as you said, after Chol Soo Lee's death. What was it like putting the film together? Was it a difficult film to put together? From what I saw of the trailer, it was a lot of historical archive footage that was used.
It was a difficult film to put together. It took us 6 years total to from start to finish for the film. But I'll speak on the archive that you mentioned. I mean, you know, the process is usually you might go to a news archive or an archival house to try and find that footage. But again, the reality is that I think for our communities, because our stories are not as valued all the time, you know, sometimes you might go and look and there's not much there. And so for us, you know, much of the archive had to come from further digging, and ultimately came from the community. Because we have a background as print journalists, because of our relationship with KW Lee, that just opened so many doors. And what we found was that many people had actually retained and kept archive personally from that era. So KW Lee had, you know, he's a pack rat, an inveterate pack rat. So he shared much material with us, and he opened a lot of doors. And before long, it was to our very pleasant surprise that we saw that there would be enough material out there in the community to make a film.
What was it like to make the film also without the subject himself alive? You said it was sparked by the fact that you were attending his funeral, but I'm guessing because of that, there must have been a voice that was missing from the documentary.
Definitely. And I think we had a deep insecurity as we were working on the film about being able to do justice to Chol Soo Lee's voice, since we never had a chance to interview him ourselves. But, you know, a couple of decisions, I think, really made us feel like all the pieces fell into place. The first thing was we made the decision to use narration in our film. And that freed us up to utilize materials like his memoirs that he had written, his speeches, other interviews, some of the recorded phone conversations he had with the journalist KW Lee, who became a father figure to him. And so then we were able to script what Chol Soo says in our film, him telling his own story. And really, we felt like we could get in depth with his feelings and his thoughts. And then, of course, the second challenge, though, was then finding the right narrator, somebody who wouldn't take us out of the film, but would actually be believable as Chol Soo Lee. And so, actually, we were very fortunate to have discovered a young man named Sebastian Yoon. He was actually the discovery of our producer, Sue Kim. And he is formerly incarcerated. He's Korean American. He had gone into prison starting at age 16 in New York. And he's currently a criminal reform activist. And he when we reached out to him to work with us, he immediately wanted to tell Chol Soo Lee's story. He told us that he could actually personally identify with his life. You know, he had joined a gang when he was in his teen years. And so he could really, I think, relate to Chol Soo feeling lonely and abandoned and even bullied as a child. And then he also could obviously relate to what it's like to be incarcerated. And that feeling of loneliness and depression and dehumanization every day. And so Sebastian actually collaborated with us on the script. And he gave us tremendous insight about that Chol Soo Lee wasn't just facing prison violence, for example, but it was those mental demons, you know, as I mentioned, the dehumanization, the loneliness. And so we were able to script new scenes based on his insights. And also we just feel like his narration is really like you can feel the lived experience. And he just brings so much like empathy, we think, to the voice of Chol Soo Lee.
It sounds like it was a very fruitful collaboration.
It's been a beautiful collaboration, yeah. And we feel so lucky that he joined our team.
And it sounds, just from this conversation alone, that although Chol Soo Lee, he is the name on that he's the subject of the film, KW Lee plays a huge part in the story as well. Then, can you tell us a little bit about him as well?
Yeah, and Julie, please feel free to jump in at any time. But K.W. Lee was one of the first journalists of Asian descent in the continental United States. He had a long career in the South, actually, at first covering the Jim Crow South and issues of poverty and class and race there, with a very sensitive eye for what he likes to refer to as the worm's eye point of view, the perspective of the people who are downtrodden, are facing that kind of oppression. And then he came to California, and this was actually, we were talking about this today. This was actually one of the first times that he worked on a story, or the first time he worked on a story about a Korean subject. And he talks about how he had to learn about the Asian community in California because he hadn't had much experience at that point. But by that point, he was already a well-established journalist, like award-winning, and was actually recruited to come to Sacramento to be their chief investigative reporter at the Sacramento Union.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that, K.W. Lee, when he came across Chol Soo Lee's case, his editor at first told him, no, you can't work on this. You're my chief investigative reporter. This crime happened in San Francisco. This is a Sacramento paper. And they sort of depended on K.W. Lee to write exposés every day. And so he made a bargain with his city editor, and he just said, please let me cover this and investigate it on my own time. So he spent 6 months of his own time investigating this and finding just this unbelievable case of somebody who had been railroaded in our American criminal justice system. It was, he saw judicial bias, and he saw witnesses who described initially a killer who was, between 5'6" and 5'10", and Chol Soo Lee is actually quite short, At most, you can say he's, between 5'3" and 5'4". And so just on that alone, you would think he would have just been dismissed as a suspect, but he wasn't. And so K.W. Lee could not believe this. He wrote a series of stories about this case, and it's really those stories that you could say triggered the landmark Asian American movement that formed after it was read by Korean Americans and Asian Americans, and these articles were actually photocopied and passed around. And people not only could see that the evidence clearly showed Chol Soo wasn't guilty of this crime, but it also showed the human side of Chol Soo Lee's story, and his being a child of the Korean War, immigrating to this country at age 12, and just being bullied at school, tossed around within the American carceral system,
Right.
Yeah, and so he wrote those stories, and really, you can credit him for helping to start this movement.
Well, it's already been incredible to hear about the story. We're quickly running out of time. There's so much more I want to talk to you about. But I understand there have been screenings in the US since last year as well. What has the reaction been like so far?
I mean, it's been extraordinary. It's been beyond, I think, what we could have imagined. I mean, we imagined this as a community film, just sort of something to make sure that this history is preserved. But the way that the reception has gone to premiere at Sundance and to have the film screened the way it has been, it's been life-changing, really. I mean, people have connected with the story of Chol Soo in a way that sort of like brings this issue very close to them. They see him not only sort of they recognize his flaws, of course, because it's a very complicated story, and that needs to, and I just want to mention that, but they also connect with his resilience, his strength, his charisma, and they see how he was able to inspire this movement, and are summarily inspired as well. And it's been wonderful to see. I mean, I think it's important to add that among the reactions we were most concerned about were the people who were involved in this case, who came to his aid. And we've been told by them that, the film has brought some sense of closure and a sense that they can speak of this movement in a way with pride that they had not necessarily been able to do before. And that's just been the most extraordinary thing, truly.
And you're also both here in Korea for the film release in Korea as well. What do you hope audiences take away from the film, especially here in Korea?
Well, I think we feel like this story, even though it took place 40 years ago, is still relevant today. we think one of the lessons is, who are the Chol Soo Lees in society today? And we encourage, especially Korean audiences, to look at the people who might feel marginalized in Korean society. For example, single moms or adoptees or North Korean defectors, people who are incarcerated, new immigrants to this country. And, maybe take inspiration from the people who built this movement that, came to the aid of this stranger, of this, poor Korean immigrant street kid, who actually was no angel, but he had a criminal record. But they still looked at him and said, you know what, you're the victim of this injustice. You are somebody who's alone, and we will give you attention, love, and care, and do what is just and righteous. And I think that's just something all of us could take inspiration from today and try to personalize that lesson in your own life.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you both here in the studio today to talk about the film. And I think many of our listeners will be rushing to check out the film and the story as well. So thank you for shedding light on this story as well. We'll wrap it up there. We've been talking to Eugene Yi and Julie Ha, the co-directors of Free Chol Soo Lee. Thank you once again for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.